The rope was already in Chester Granger's hand when he stopped moving. He had crossed 4 mountain passes, ridden 3 days through frozen mud and pine shadow, and arrived in the town of Caldwell Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1878 with a single purpose burning in his chest like a coal that would not die. He needed a rope, a good rope, one that would hold 230 pounds of mountain man and not snap under the pressure of a hard wind. He knew exactly what gauge he wanted, exactly what length, exactly what kind of hemp twist would serve him on the higher elevations where everything froze and the lines that lowered supply crates down the cliff face behind his cabin had to be trusted with a man's life. He had the rope in his hand. He was standing in Dunmore's general store at 11:30 in the morning, and the rope was good. He could feel it. Clean braid, proper tension, no fraying at the ends. And then she spoke. Not to him. She did not even know he was there. She was standing at the counter with her back to him, and her voice was low and urgent and threaded through with something Chester recognized instantly, because he had heard it before in his own chest during the worst year of his life. It was the sound of a person who was not going to break, not yet, not in public, but who was running out of time before they did. "I am telling you, Mr. Dunmore," Helen Grady said, and her voice did not waver, though Chester could hear the effort it cost her, "that my father signed that account over to me before he died. I have the paper. I have his signature witnessed by Reverend Alcott himself. You cannot refuse me credit on the basis of a rumor that Silas Holt is spreading, because he wants my land and cannot buy it from me honestly." The man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow with ink-stained fingers and the expression of someone who had already made up his mind before the conversation began, spread his hands flat on the wooden surface and tilted his head in a way that was not quite an apology and not quite a threat, but lived in the ugly space between the two. "Miss Grady, I have got nothing against you personally. But Silas Holt has got a lien claim filed in the county office, and until that dispute is settled by the circuit judge, I cannot extend credit to a party whose assets are under legal question. That is just good business." "That lien claim is fraudulent," Helen said. "He filed it on the basis of a forged document, and I can prove it." "Then prove it to the judge," Dunmore said, and turned away. Chester Granger put the rope down on the barrel beside him. He did not think about it. He did not make a decision in any formal sense. His hand simply opened and the rope fell, and he walked to the counter and he said, "I will vouch for her account." Both of them turned to look at him. He was a large man. Not in the brutish, threatening sense, but in the way that mountains are large, which is to say quietly and without apology. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall with shoulders that had been built by years of chopping wood and hauling timber and climbing rock faces that no sensible person would attempt. His beard was dark brown going gray at the jaw, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that the high mountain lakes turned in October. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and his boots were caked with 3 states' worth of dried mud. Helen Grady looked at him as though she was trying to determine whether he was an opportunity or a new problem. She was 27 years old, with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up under a practical brown hat, and brown eyes that were currently doing rapid and precise calculations behind their surface. She was not tall, but she held herself like someone who had decided a long time ago that height was optional. She had a smudge of what looked like axle grease on her left hand, and her coat had been mended at the collar so neatly that you would only notice if you were looking closely, which Chester was. "You do not know me," she said. "No," Chester agreed. "But I know a fraudulent lien when I hear about one, and I know the sound of a county clerk being leaned on by a man with money. I have got an account at this store, and I have never missed a payment. That ought to be worth something." Dunmore looked deeply uncomfortable. He glanced at the door as if expecting someone to walk through it and resolve the situation for him. No one did. Chester looked at him steadily. "Unless you have a reason to turn down a cash-backing guarantee from a customer in good standing, I suggest you fill the lady's order." There was a long pause. Then Dunmore reached for his ledger. Helen Grady said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I did not ask for your help." Chester said, "You did not. I was managing." "You were," he agreed. She studied him for another beat. Then she said, "Thank you," and the word came out clean and genuine and not at all grudging, which surprised him. He went back to the barrel where he had set the rope down. It was gone. Someone had moved it, or he had set it down wrong and it had rolled, or perhaps a clerk had tidied it away. He spent 10 minutes looking for it and could not find another of the same gauge in the whole store. Dunmore apologized and said the next shipment was 3 weeks out. Chester stood in the middle of Dunmore's general store holding nothing, and he thought about 3 days riding back up into the mountains without the thing he had come for. Then Helen Grady appeared at his elbow with a folded paper bag of her own purchases held against her chest and said, "I have a rope at my farm. It is good hemp, 12 gauge. My father bought it and never opened the packing. You are welcome to it. It is the least I can do." He looked at her. She looked back. "That is generous," he said. "It is practical," she said. "I have no use for it and you clearly do. Come by this afternoon if you want it. The Grady farm is 2 miles east on the creek road. You cannot miss it. The fence post on the south corner has a broken top rail." She walked out of the store. Chester stood there for a moment longer. Then he went to see about getting his horse some water and feed at the livery, because it was going to be an afternoon. The creek road east of Caldwell Creek was a good road, as western roads went in 1878, which meant that it had ruts in it that were only about 4 inches deep rather than the axle-grinding trenches that passed for thoroughfares further north. The aspens on both sides had gone full gold in the October cold, and the light coming through them turned everything amber and honey-colored, and Chester found himself riding slower than necessary, which was not a thing he normally did. He had lived alone on the mountain for 6 years. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, because the amber light and the golden aspens were doing something to his thinking, and he was a man who liked his thinking clear. 6 years of solitude by choice. Not because of a dark past, not because of some hidden wound he was nursing, but because he had gone up there after his surveying partner died in a rockfall, and he had found that the silence suited him and the work suited him, and the absence of other people's noise and needs suited him in a way that he had not expected to miss when he eventually came back to it. He was 34 years old. He was not lonely. He was not brooding. He was, by his own assessment, a reasonably content man who chopped his own wood and grew his own food, and read everything he could get his hands on during the long winter months when the mountain closed itself down to visitors. He arrived at the Grady farm at 2:30 and pulled his horse up short at the gate. The place was in trouble. Not dramatically, not in any single catastrophic way, but in the accumulative way of a property that had been maintained by one fewer person than it needed for longer than its current occupant could compensate for. The fence on the south side sagged in 3 places beyond the broken post Helen had mentioned. The barn roof had a visible dip at the center ridge. That meant the supporting beam inside was compromised. The kitchen garden had been dug in recently, but the rows were shorter than they should have been for a full winter's stores, and the firewood pile beside the house was decent but not sufficient for a Colorado mountain winter. A woman doing the work of 2 people, Chester thought, and doing it well, and running slightly behind. Helen came out of the barn when she heard his horse, and she was carrying a pitchfork which she leaned against the barn door in a pointed, deliberate way when she saw him. She had taken her hat off and her hair was coming loose from its pins. "You came," she said. "You offered a rope," he said. "I did," she nodded toward the barn. "Come in, I will find it for you." The inside of the barn was organized with the particular precision of someone who had limited resources and had learned to know exactly where everything was because losing time searching was a luxury she could not afford. Tack hung in order on pegs. Tools were racked and clean. 2 horses stood in their stalls, a solid working mare and a younger animal that was favoring its left foreleg, and Chester's eye went to the injured horse automatically. "That leg needs attention," he said. "I know," Helen said. "I have been keeping it rested. The farrier comes through next week. It will be worse by next week. The tendon is hot. You can see it from here." He moved to the stall without asking permission, which he registered a half-second later as possibly presumptuous, but Helen did not tell him to stop. She watched him run his hand carefully down the horse's foreleg, feeling the inflammation. "What would you do?" she asked, and her voice was genuinely curious rather than defensive. "Cold water treatment. The creek is close. 15 minutes twice a day for 3 days. And there is a poultice my mother used to make with comfrey root and clay that draws the heat out. I can tell you the proportions if you have the materials." "I have comfrey," she said slowly, "and the creek is 40 yards from the barn." "Then the farrier will find a healthier animal when he arrives," Chester said. He stepped back from the stall and they looked at each other in the filtered barn light, and there was a quality to the silence that Chester recognized as meaningful without being able to immediately define it. Helen moved to the back of the barn and began shifting crates. "The rope is here somewhere. My father was very organized, but his system made sense only to him." Chester helped her move the crates, and they worked together in the companionable way of two people who are comfortable with physical labor, and after 7 minutes they found the rope, still in its original packing paper, exactly as she had described. 12 gauge, good hemp, well stored. "This is a good rope," Chester said. "My father bought good things when he could afford them," Helen said. She was looking at the rope with an expression that had something private in it, and Chester gave her a moment before he spoke again. "How long ago did he pass?" he asked. 8 months, she said. "March, the influenza. I am sorry." "So am I," she took a breath. "He left me the farm and the account at Dunmore's and a letter explaining everything he knew about running both. And approximately 4 months later Silas Holt filed his fraudulent lien, and I have been fighting that battle ever since while also trying to keep the farm from falling apart around me." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, as a statement of the situation. Then she looked at him directly. "What is your business on the mountain?" "Trapping some. Timber surveying, mostly. The railroad companies pay for accurate surveys of the high-elevation passes." "That is solitary work," she said. "Yes. Do you like it?" He considered the question seriously, which she seemed to appreciate. "I like the work. I like knowing where things are. Mountains do not change much." "No," she said, "they do not." Something in her voice suggested she found that either comforting or enviable. He picked up the rope. He should go. He had what he came for, and the ride back to the base of the mountain was 2 hours, and he had wanted to start the climb before dark. He did not go. He said, "That barn roof, the ridge beam." Helen looked at him with the expression of someone who was steeling herself for an estimate that would break her current budget entirely. "It is not collapsed yet," he said. "If you sistered a secondary beam alongside the compromised one before the first heavy snow, it would hold another several seasons. It is a half-day job with the right lumber." "I know," she said. "I have been trying to decide whether to try it myself or wait until I can afford Callum Davies. Davies is reliable, but he charges $3 a day." "I am aware of what Davies charges," she said, with the first trace of sharpness he had heard from her. "I could do it in the morning," he said. The sharpness vanished and was replaced by something more complicated. "Why?" she asked. It was a fair question, and she deserved a straight answer, and he did not entirely have one, which unsettled him. He said, "Because the work needs doing, and I am here, and it is the right thing to do." Helen Grady looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I will feed you supper tonight and breakfast in the morning in exchange for the labor, and you can put your horse in the barn." "That is fair," Chester said. It was the most domestically complicated sentence he had spoken in approximately 6 years, and he felt the weight of it in a way that was not unpleasant, which was possibly the most unsettling thing that had happened to him in a very long time. Supper was salt pork and beans and cornbread and dried apple pie. That was better than it had any right to be given how simple the components were. Helen cooked with the same organized efficiency she applied to everything else, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and Chester sat at a table that had clearly been built by someone with more skill than the average frontier carpenter. the legs turned on a lathe with visible care, and he thought about the man who had built it and left his daughter alone with a fraudulent lien filed against her name. They talked over supper in the way of people who have each been alone for a while and discover that the other person is worth talking to, which is a particular kind of conversation that starts carefully and then accelerates. She asked him about the mountain surveys, and he described the process, the triangulation, the spirit levels, the painstaking recording of elevations and distances, and he found himself talking about it with more animation than he had anticipated, because she asked intelligent questions and did not pretend interest she did not feel. She told him about her father, Martin Grady, who had come to Colorado from Ohio in 1861 and had built the farm by himself over 15 years, and who had read everything he could get his hands on, which explained the small but dense bookshelf Chester had noticed beside the fireplace. He was a good man, she said, and there was a quality of completeness about the statement as though it closed something. "What do you know about Holt's operation?" Chester asked. Her jaw tightened slightly. "He runs cattle on the eastern range, about 3,000 acres. He wants my land because it gives him creek access that he does not currently have, and without that access he has to route his drives 12 miles further north, which costs him time and money. He knows the land is valuable, and he knows I am alone, and he thinks he can manufacture enough legal trouble to force me to sell at whatever price he names." She paused. "He underestimated how much trouble I am willing to make." "What does the circuit judge think?" "Judge Harlan is due through in November. That is 5 weeks away. I have my father's deed properly recorded in Denver. I have the witness transfer document. I have the original survey record. Holt's forged lien is based on a supposed loan agreement that does not exist. The forgery is good, but it is not perfect, and I have a letter from a document examiner in Denver who has agreed to testify." She looked at him steadily. "I am going to win. I just have to survive until November without running out of credit or losing the barn." Chester looked at the woman across the table from him, lit by the warm light of the oil lamp, quietly furious and quietly determined in equal measure, and felt something shift in his chest in a manner that was inconvenient and unmistakable. "You will win," he said. "I know I will," she said, and her absolute certainty of it was one of the most compelling things he had ever encountered. He slept in the barn that night on a bedroll he carried in his pack, and he was not bothered by this. The horses were good company, and the barn was warm enough, and he lay awake for a while, looking at the dark ceiling and thinking about things that he had not thought about in some years. Specifically, whether the life he had built was the life he intended to keep, and whether intention was even the right framework for the question. He was up before dawn and had the barn roof measurements taken by the time the light was strong enough to work by, and by the time Helen came out with coffee at 7 o'clock, he had already identified the secondary beam he needed from a stack of seasoned timber at the back of the property, correctly identified by him as timber her father had stored for exactly this kind of repair. She handed him the coffee and looked at the timber he had pulled out and said, "You found his emergency store." "Behind the leftmost stack," he said. "He was organized." "He was," she said softly. They worked together through the morning, Helen taking the lower-end tasks with easy competence, Chester doing the high work on the barn roof that required weight and reach, and they talked as they worked in a way that felt entirely natural and entirely new to him simultaneously. She was funny. Not in a performative way, but in the dry, observational way of someone who had spent a lot of time thinking, and not enough time having an audience for those thoughts, and several times he laughed with genuine surprise. At noon she made coffee and biscuits, and they sat on the fence of the south pasture and ate, and the October sun was warm enough to make it pleasant, and Chester had the peculiar sensation of not wanting to be anywhere else, which was remarkable because for 6 years he had wanted to be almost exclusively on his mountain. "Tell me about where you live," Helen said. He described it. The cabin he had built in his second year on the mountain, after the first improvised shelter proved inadequate for the third winter. The view from the front step, which was 4 mountain ranges receding into blue distance, the creek that ran cold and clear year-round behind the cabin. The library he had assembled piece by piece over 6 years, mostly through the Denver bookseller who accepted mail orders, which currently occupied 3 full walls and overflowed into the kitchen. Helen listened with her full attention, which was a thing he noticed because she had the quality of actually hearing what people said rather than waiting for her turn to speak. "It sounds beautiful," she said. "It is," he said. Then, "It is also very quiet." She looked at him. "Is that still what you want?" He held her gaze. "I am less certain than I was 3 days ago." She looked away first, out at the pasture where her horses were grazing, the younger one walking more evenly now after its first cold water treatment that morning. Then she said, "I am not in a position to be the thing that changes a man's mind about his life, Chester. I have a farm with a fraudulent lien against it and 5 weeks until a circuit judge and a barn roof that needs fixing and $400 in the bank and no one else to rely on." "I know," he said. "I am telling you this clearly because I think you are a direct person and you deserve a direct answer to a direct implication." "That is fair," he said. "I am not sending you away," she said. "I am just telling you what I am. I am not asking you to be anything different," he said. "I am just telling you what I am, which is a man who is presently less certain about things than he was 3 days ago." She looked at him again, and the corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but lived adjacent to one. "Fix the barn roof," she said. "We can be uncertain together." He fixed the barn roof. The secondary beam went in clean and true, and by 4 o'clock the ridge was supported well enough to survive a significant snow load, and Chester came down off the ladder and looked at it with the satisfaction of a job done correctly, which was one of the reliable pleasures of his life. He should go. He had the rope. The mountain was waiting. Instead he said, "I would like to stay another day." Helen was putting tools away in their proper places on the barn wall, and she did not turn around immediately. When she did, she said, "I would like that too." He stayed 3 days more. The second day he repaired the south fence, all 3 sagging sections, while Helen split wood, and he occasionally abandoned the fence to help her with the larger rounds that required 2 people or a better maul than she had. And they worked side by side in the cool afternoon, and the woodpile grew substantial. The third day it rained, and they spent most of it inside. Chester reading from her father's bookshelf with the particular pleasure of encountering books he had not read yet. Helen writing letters at the kitchen table, the letters to Denver and to the county court, and to witnesses she was assembling for the November hearing. And they were quiet together in the comfortable way that takes most people months to achieve. He read aloud to her from a natural history of the Colorado Rockies that her father had owned, and she listened while she wrote, and occasionally she would say something about a passage that showed she had been paying full attention even while her hand kept moving across the paper. That evening at supper he said, "Tell me about your mother." Helen's expression shifted into something more private and more careful. "She died when I was 9. Fever. My father raised me after that. Did he do a good job?" She thought about it genuinely. "He taught me to read and to calculate and to do carpentry and to care for animals and to stand up straight in a disagreement and to find the fraudulent element in any document I was being asked to sign. Yes, he did a very good job." "He sounds like he would have been good company," Chester said. "He was," Helen said. "The best I have had." She paused and looked at him. "Until recently." Chester felt the warmth of that move through him like the coffee had moved through him that first morning. Clean and straightforward and good. On the 4th day, the day he had definitively decided would be his last before he returned to the mountain, 3 things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was that he walked out to the creek in the early morning with a fishing line because he had seen good trout sign the day before and he wanted to contribute something to the larder before he left, and he had been fishing for about 20 minutes when he heard horses on the eastern road. Not 1 horse. 4 horses. Moving at the deliberate pace of men who were not rushing because they did not feel they needed to. He came back to the tree line and watched from the aspens. The 4 riders stopped at the farm gate. Their horses were well-bred and their gear was expensive, and one of them wore a coat that Chester recognized as the kind of thing a prosperous cattleman wore when he wanted to look prosperous. He was perhaps 50, with a square face and pale eyes and the air of someone who had gotten used to having his way. Silas Holt, Chester was certain of it. Helen came out of the farmhouse and stood on the porch and did not go to the gate and did not invite them in, which Chester recognized as the correct strategic choice. He could not hear everything from the tree line, but he heard the shape of it. Holt's voice was smooth and reasonable, the voice of a man making an offer he considered generous. Helen's voice was level and uninflected, the voice of a woman who was not interested in the offer and was not going to pretend otherwise. It went on for about 5 minutes. Then Holt's tone changed, only slightly, but Chester could hear the shift from smooth to something underneath the smooth, and he moved out of the tree line and walked toward the gate. One of the riders saw him first and said something to Holt, who turned in his saddle and looked at Chester with the measuring expression of a man assessing a potential complication. Chester walked up to the gate and stood beside Helen and said nothing. Holt looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I do not believe I know you." "Chester Granger," Chester said. "I am visiting Miss Grady." "Visiting," Holt said, in a tone that suggested he was annotating this information for future use. "Well, Mr. Granger, this is a private business discussion." "Then you can continue it with Miss Grady's attorney in the county court," Chester said. "Unless you have legitimate business at this gate, I suggest you and your men ride on." There was a pause that had the specific quality of a situation that could go badly or could turn around, and the outcome was not entirely settled yet. Chester held Holt's pale gaze and did not move and did not change his expression, and he was aware, without making it obvious, that he was standing in a way that made his actual physical dimensions clear. Holt made the calculation. He was a bully with resources, but he was not stupid, and stupid was what you had to be to push a physical confrontation with a man that size on that man's home territory. "We will have our conversation in the court then," Holt said pleasantly and wheeled his horse, and the 4 riders went back down the eastern road. Helen let out a breath that she had been holding very still. Chester looked at her. "He has done that before." "Every 2 weeks since June," she said. "The offer goes down each time and the tone gets a little worse." She paused. "Having someone standing beside me was useful." "I imagine it was," Chester said. She looked at him directly. "You are leaving today." "I was," he said. She did not say anything to that. She waited. "I would like to propose something," Chester said, "and I want you to hear it as a practical proposal and not an imposition or an assumption." "All right," she said. "I can return to the mountain, do the work I need to do before the first snow closes the upper passes, and come back down in 3 weeks. That would give me 2 weeks before the circuit judge arrives. In those 2 weeks I can be present for any further visits from Holt's men, and I can be present at the hearing itself as a character witness if that is useful to you." He paused. "I am asking because I want to, not because I think you cannot manage without me." Helen Grady looked at him with those calculating brown eyes and said, "You know that if you come back this becomes something." "Yes," he said, "I know that. And you want it too." He thought about honesty versus caution and chose honesty, because it was what she deserved. "Helen, I came to town for a rope and spent 4 days repairing your barn and your fence and your horse's tendon and reading your father's books beside your fire. I think it is already something." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come back in 3 weeks. I will have the spare room properly made up." He rode away on his mountain with the rope she had given him coiled over his saddle horn, and for the first 2 days of the climb he thought about nothing but the route, which was how he maintained his clear head on difficult terrain. But by the 3rd day, when he reached the upper pasture and the cabin came into view against the blue-white sky, he found himself thinking about a woman at a counter in a general store refusing to be moved by a man who thought money solved everything. and he found himself thinking about a kitchen lamp and dry wit and brown eyes doing calculations, and the particular way she had said, "Come back in 3 weeks," as though she was already planning for the fact that he would. He worked. He worked harder and faster than he normally did, with the specific discipline of a man who has given himself a deadline. He completed the autumn survey of the North Pass, which the railroad company had been requesting for 2 months. He laid in his own winter wood supply, which was already adequate, but he added another week's worth because the coming winter had the feel of a hard one. He checked every trap line, recorded everything that needed recording, patched a section of his own roof where a late-season storm had pulled a shingle loose. He also, in the evenings, started writing down the comfrey poultice recipe and a number of other things he knew about animal care and farm maintenance that he thought might be useful. And then he recognized what he was doing and smiled at himself in the small mirror he kept over the wash basin, because he was preparing information to bring to someone, which was a thing you did for someone you were thinking about continuously. He came back down the mountain in exactly 3 weeks. He stopped in Caldwell Creek to collect the mail he received through the post office there and to buy a few items from Dunmore's, and Dunmore was more than usually forthcoming with information, in the way of small-town general store owners who see everything and organize it into narrative. "Trouble with Miss Grady is heating up," Dunmore said, wrapping Chester's coffee purchase. "Holt filed another piece of paper last week. Secondary claim on the water rights." Chester looked at him. "On what basis?" "Some argument about an 1876 water compact. Carter Thompson, Holt's attorney, is very good at finding arguments." "Does she know?" "She was in here day before yesterday. She knows." Dunmore paused. "She also asked me if a large man from the mountains had been in recently. I told her not yet." Chester picked up his package. "She has her hearing in 2 weeks. Is there anything else I should know?" Dunmore told him that 2 of Helen's nearest neighbors, the Pittman family to the north and old Edgars to the west, had recently declined to speak on her behalf at the hearing, both citing concerns about being on the wrong side of Holt's water access disputes. This was new information, and it was concerning because it spoke to Holt's broader strategy, which was to isolate Helen and ensure that the circuit judge arrived in Caldwell Creek hearing only one organized voice. Chester rode out to the Grady farm with that information arranged in his mind like the lines of a survey, each element in its proper relation to the others. Helen was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, turning the last of the fall soil before the hard freeze made it impossible, and she straightened up when she heard his horse and pushed the hair back from her face and looked at him with an expression that was so genuinely glad to see him that he felt it like a physical thing. "You are back," she said. "I said I would be," he said. She came to the gate and he dismounted, and they stood on opposite sides of the fence for a moment, and then she opened the gate and he led his horse through and she said, "Come inside. I have news and I suspect you do as well." They sat at the kitchen table where he had read to her 3 weeks ago and traded information like 2 people working on the same problem, which was precisely what they were. Helen's document examiner in Denver had confirmed the forgery analysis and had agreed to appear at the hearing. The circuit judge, Harlan, had a reputation for being rigorous and impartial, and was known to look unfavorably on manufactured legal proceedings, which was encouraging. The new water rights claim was a complication, but Helen had already written to the State Water Board in Denver requesting the original 1876 compact records, and her reading of the relevant statutes suggested that Holt's interpretation was being stretched well beyond its actual text. "The Pittmans and Edgars," Chester said, "are worried about being on the losing side of Holt's next legal action. That is what he is doing, not just to you. He is creating a general climate of anxiety in the county so that everyone feels the cost of opposing him." "I know," Helen said. "It is a very effective strategy." She paused. "Unless enough people decide that the cost of not opposing him is higher." "Do you think you can bring them back?" "I think if I sit down with Abigail Pittman she will come," Helen said. She is the one who makes the decisions, whatever Thomas says in public, and if the Pittmans come, Edgar's will follow." She looked at him. "Would you go with me?" "Yes," he said. "Not as muscle," she said firmly. "I do not want intimidation. I want honest persuasion." "I know," he said. "I was not offering to intimidate anyone. I was offering to be there because two people making a case are more persuasive than one, and because I am an outside party without a stake in the local politics, which sometimes helps people feel less trapped." She looked at him carefully. "You have thought about this?" "I have had 3 weeks," he said. The corner of her mouth moved in that almost smile that he had been thinking about on the mountain, the one that lived just at the edge of a more open expression, and suggested that the more open expression was available, and she was just being careful about who she showed it to. They went to the Pittman farm the following morning. It was Helen who did the talking, which was as it should be, and Chester sat at the Pittmans' kitchen table and drank their coffee and let Helen's clear, organized, unfrightened certainty do the work that it was very good at doing. Abigail Pittman was a sharp-eyed woman of about 40 who asked 3 hard questions and listened to the answers with genuine attention, and at the end of the conversation she said she would come to the hearing and so would Thomas, and would they like more coffee. Edgar's was easier once the Pittmans were committed, just as Helen had predicted. The week before the hearing was the longest week Chester had experienced in some years. Not because the outcome was uncertain, though it was, and not because Helen was afraid, because she was not in any way that she showed, but because the waiting had a quality to it that pressed against every day with its accumulated weight, and being with Helen in that pressing weight felt like the most natural and also the most significant thing that had happened to him in his adult life. They spent the evenings reading and talking, and occasionally arguing about things they disagreed on, which happened more than either of them had expected, and which both of them enjoyed enormously. She thought his assessment of certain mountain terrain as permanently impassable was too conservative, and he thought her assessment of certain legal arguments as straightforward was too optimistic, and they were both partly right about the other's position, which made the conversations productive in the way that only honest disagreement between two people who respect each other can be. On the 5th evening, sitting by the fire with a book closed in her lap and the lamp burning low, Helen said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up from his own book. "When you put that rope down on the barrel," she said, "I saw it. I watched you do it. I was pretending not to look, but I was looking, and I watched you set the rope down and walk over, and I thought, that is either going to be a complication or a godsend, and I was not in a position to afford a complication." She paused. "I am still not in a position to afford a complication." "Is that what I am?" Chester asked. She looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "that is my point." He held her gaze for a long moment. The fire moved between them in the quiet. "Helen," he said, and he said it in the particular way that a man says a name when the name has become the organizing principle of his recent life. She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she said, "Come here." He moved from his chair to the settle beside her, and she turned toward him, and they looked at each other in the firelight for one of those moments that stretches longer than its actual duration. And then he took her hand, her ink-stained writing hand, and held it carefully, as though it was something he did not want to damage. She leaned against him, just slightly, just enough, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that by the fire for the remainder of the evening, and neither of them said much else, and neither of them needed to. The night before the hearing, Helen could not sleep. Chester knew this because the farmhouse was small enough that he could hear her moving in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. The soft sounds of a woman who was trying not to disturb anyone and was failing only slightly. He lay in the spare room and listened to the sounds of the house and thought about whether to get up. And then he did, because it seemed to him that this was a night when being alone was the worst option. She was at the kitchen table with a lamp and a cup of cold coffee and a stack of papers she had clearly already read 3 times at least, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway and said, "I woke you." "No," he said. He sat down across from her and looked at the papers. "Is there anything we have missed?" She almost smiled. "You are asking if there is work to do. There generally is." "Chester," she said, "everything is in order. My papers are in order. My witnesses are coming. My document examiner will be there. The judge is reputable. I am going to win." She paused. "I know I am going to win. I just cannot sleep." "Then we will not sleep together," he said, and then realized how that sounded, and she laughed. A real laugh. The first completely unguarded laugh he had heard from her, bright and surprised, and the sound of it did something permanent to his chest. "That was not what I meant," he said. "I know what you meant," she said, still laughing. "Put the kettle on." They sat together until nearly 4 in the morning, drinking fresh coffee and talking about things that had nothing to do with the hearing. Her father's stories about Ohio, his own early years in Missouri before the surveying work took him west, a book they had both read and had completely opposite responses to, a theory she had about why certain varieties of apple tasted different at altitude that turned out to be grounded in actual botanical reasoning and not just fancy. When the sky began to lighten, she said, "Thank you for this." "It was good coffee," he said. "Yes," she said, "it was." She looked at him across the table, tired and warm and entirely herself, and said, "Chester, whatever happens today, I want you to know that these past weeks have been the best I have felt since before my father died. I want you to know that." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Whatever happens today," he said, "we will handle it together." She turned her hand over and held his briefly and firmly. Then she stood up and said, "I am going to make us a proper breakfast, and then we are going to go win a court hearing." The circuit court in Caldwell Creek was held in the largest room available, which was the back room of the town hall, a low-ceilinged space that smelled of sawdust and cold coffee, and the accumulated nervous energy of every legal proceeding that had ever been held in it. Judge Harlan had arrived the previous evening and had already reviewed the filed documents, which was his habit, and he had the demeanor of a man who had seen everything and was not easily impressed or deceived. Helen arrived with Chester on one side, and the Pittmans and Edgars and 2 other neighbors she had persuaded in the preceding weeks arranged behind her, which Chester had helped to organize during the final 3 days, working through the same clear, honest arguments they had used on Abigail Pittman, and finding the same traction each time, because what Helen's case rested on was the simple fact that it was correct and people knew it. Silas Holt arrived with Carter Thompson, his attorney, who was everything Dunmore had indicated, polished and precise, and very good at making fraudulent positions sound reasonable. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Judge Harlan was thorough and impartial and rigorous and entirely willing to ask hard questions of both sides. And the hard questions he asked of Thompson regarding the provenance of the loan agreement at the center of the fraudulent lien produced a sequence of answers that grew progressively less coherent, which the judge noted in writing at least twice. Helen's document examiner, a quiet man from Denver named Abbott, explained in precise and accessible terms exactly how the paper stock and ink composition of the alleged loan agreement were inconsistent with the date it was supposed to have been written, and why this was not a matter of interpretation but of physical chemistry. And Judge Harlan asked him 2 technical questions that demonstrated the judge had been paying complete attention. Helen herself was called to speak, and she was exactly what Chester had known she would be. Clear and organized and unemotional and utterly certain of the facts, speaking to the judge as though explaining something evident to a reasonable person, which was the correct approach with this particular judge, and which she would have used regardless because it was simply how she operated. Holt's case did not survive the afternoon. Judge Harlan found in Helen's favor on all counts. The fraudulent lien was dismissed. The secondary water rights claim was found to be based on a misreading of the 1876 compact that the judge characterized as either incompetent or deliberately dishonest, and in either case without merit. The Grady farm deed was affirmed as valid and free of any encumbrance. Holt was assessed a significant portion of the court costs and given a pointed written warning about the consequences of filing fraudulent documents in his jurisdiction, which Judge Harlan delivered with the specific tone of a man who was going to remember this and act accordingly if it happened again. It was over. Helen stood very still for a moment when the gavel came down, and Chester watched her absorb it, the ending of months of sustained effort and fear and determination, and he saw the moment when it moved through her and settled. Then she turned to him, and her eyes were bright and her expression was open in a way he had not seen before, fully open, the calculation and the guardedness and the careful management all released at once. "We won," she said. "You won," he corrected. "Chester," she said. "You did the work for months before I ever arrived," he said. "I helped at the edges. You stood beside me at the gate," she said. "You sat with me at 2 in the morning. You did not let me fight it alone." She held his gaze. "We won." He did not argue with that. The celebration that evening at the Grady farm was spontaneous and pleasant, the Pittmans and Edgars and a few other neighbors who had come for the hearing ending up at the kitchen table, and the parlor with whatever food was in the house, and someone produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and there was more laughter in that farmhouse than it had likely heard in a long time. Chester sat at the edge of it and felt entirely comfortable, which was a thing he took note of because he was not a man who had historically been comfortable in groups of people. At some point late in the evening, when most of the neighbors had gone and only the Pittmans remained helping with the clearing up and were themselves nearly ready to go, Abigail Pittman found Chester on the back porch looking out at the dark pasture and said, "You are staying then?" It was not a question. "I think so," Chester said. "Good," Abigail said, with the finality of a woman who has assessed a situation and given her verdict. "She has been too alone. Her father was good company, but one person is not enough." She paused. "You are a decent man from what I have seen." "I am trying to be," Chester said. "Try successfully," Abigail said, and went back inside. When the Pittmans left and the farmhouse was quiet and the fire was settling, Helen came and stood beside him on the back porch, and they looked out at the dark together, and the cold was sharp and clean, and the stars were extraordinary in the way that the Colorado sky produced in October. "I need to talk to you about something," Chester said. "All right," she said. He turned to face her. "I am going to be direct with you because you have been direct with me, and I think you deserve that more than you deserve anything I could dress it up to sound better than it is." "I respect that," she said. "I came down from that mountain 3 weeks ago because I could not stop thinking about you," he said. "I came back in November because I could not imagine not coming back. I have spent the last 4 weeks working on your farm and sitting at your table and talking to you until 2 in the morning and standing beside you at a county hearing. And I am 34 years old, and I have lived alone for 6 years by choice, and I am telling you that this is not something I am confused about. I know what this is." Helen looked at him with the full weight of her brown eyes and the full clarity of a person who has spent months making important decisions alone and is not afraid of the weight of another important decision. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I am asking if you want this to continue," he said. "Not because I am uncertain about what I want, but because I am not going to assume anything about what you want, and I am not going to push against what you have told me before, which was that you could not be the thing that changed a man's life. I want you to choose it if you want it. I do not want you to feel like it happened to you." She was quiet for a moment. The stars moved above them in the cold. "Chester," she said slowly, "I have been alone for 8 months, and in those 8 months I have managed a fraudulent legal attack and a barn roof and a sick horse and a winter wood supply, and the accounts and the planting and the animals and the grief of losing my father, all by myself, and I have done it because I had no choice, and because it is what needed to be done." She paused. "And in the last 4 weeks I have had someone beside me, and I have been sharper and steadier and better in every way than I was before, and I do not think that is a coincidence." She looked at him. I have been choosing it since the first evening you sat down at my table. I have been choosing it every day." He reached up and touched her face carefully, and she turned into his hand very slightly, and he bent down and kissed her, and she kissed him back with her hands against his chest, and the cold sky enormous above them, and the stars absolutely indifferent to the magnitude of what was happening on this back porch in Colorado in October of 1878. When they broke apart, she kept her hands against his coat and looked up at him and said, "Your mountain." "I am not leaving it," he said, "but I am not going back to living alone on it." She considered that. "I am not leaving this farm." "I know," he said, "nor should you." He paused. "The mountain is 3 days' ride. That is workable for the survey seasons. The rest of the time I am here." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a large adjustment for a man who has lived alone for 6 years." "Yes," he said simply, "it is. And you want to make it." "Helen," he said, "I put that rope down on a barrel in a general store and I have not gone back for it yet. I think I am past the point of uncertainty about what I want." She laughed, that bright, surprised laugh that had become one of his favorite sounds in the world. "You never went back for the rope?" "No," he said. "Does that bother you?" "Not even slightly," he said. She leaned against him and he held her there on the porch in the cold, and the farm spread out around them in the dark. The fence he had repaired, the barn with its sound new ridge beam, the kitchen garden turned and ready for spring, the horses in the pasture moving like dark shapes against the stars. The weeks that followed had a quality that Chester could only describe afterward as the particular texture of a life that had found its proper shape. He made a third and final trip up the mountain in late November to complete the winter preparations, this time with a definite date of return, and the cabin felt different when he knew he was closing it for a season rather than settling into it for the usual long isolation. He packed his books carefully, brought the ones he most wanted down with him, and spent a last evening watching the sun set over the 4 mountain ranges from his front step. It was beautiful. It was still beautiful. He had not stopped loving it. He just also loved something else now. He came down the mountain for the last time that season on the 23rd of November, 3 days before the first real snowstorm closed the upper passes. And when he rode through the gate of the Grady farm in the gray afternoon light, Helen came out of the house and walked down to meet him, and he swung down from the horse and she put her arms around him, right there in the yard, without ceremony, and held on, and he held her back, and the snow began while they were standing there. December was the best month of Chester Granger's life, which was not something he had expected to be able to say. They settled into each other with the ease of two people who had already established the important things, that they could work together, that they could disagree without damage, that they could sit in comfortable silence, that they found each other endlessly worth talking to, that the practical business of daily life on a working farm was something they could navigate without friction, because they both approached it with the same orientation toward competence and honesty. Helen was the better cook. Chester was the better carpenter. Helen was faster with the accounts. Chester knew more about animal care. Helen could outread him on legal documents. Chester could read terrain. They did not compete about any of this. They just applied it. Christmas was quiet and warm, and Helen made a roast chicken and a dried fruit pudding from a recipe her mother had apparently carried from somewhere in Ireland. And Chester gave her a complete set of botanical survey maps of Colorado that he had been assembling from his own survey work over 6 years, hand-drawn with the particular precision he applied to everything, and she held them with both hands and looked at them for a long time. "These are extraordinary," she said. "They are not finished," he said. "I thought we could finish them together." She looked up at him. "You want me to come up the mountain with you?" "In the spring," he said. "When the passes open, not for the whole survey season unless you want to, but for a stretch. I want you to see it." She set the maps down on the kitchen table with great care and said, "Yes, I want that." He gave her one more thing at Christmas, smaller, wrapped in the same brown paper that Dunmore's used for packages, and she unwrapped it with her usual efficiency and went still when she saw what it was. It was a ring. Not elaborate, not expensive in the showy sense, but well-made. A narrow band of good silver with a single small stone that was the particular gray-green of his eyes in October. He had ridden into Caldwell Creek 2 weeks earlier specifically to visit the watchmaker who also sold jewelry, and had spent an hour with the man going through his stock until he found the stone, which he had then asked to be set simply because anything ornate on Helen Grady's hand would be wrong. "Chester," she said, "I want to be clear that this is not an ultimatum or a pressure or an expectation," he said, because he had thought carefully about how to say this. "This is an expression of what I want, which is to spend the rest of my life with you, and I am putting it on the table the same way you have put everything on the table, directly and honestly, and I would like an answer when you are ready to give one, which does not have to be now." Helen Grady looked at the ring in her palm for exactly 6 seconds, which Chester counted because he was measuring everything in that moment with the precision of a surveyor. Then she said, "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back, clear-eyed and certain and wholly herself. "Yes, Chester, I do not need more time. I have known what I wanted since October." She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. Then she stepped forward and kissed him with considerable enthusiasm, and the roast chicken almost burned. They were married in the spring, on the 15th of April, 1879, in the small white church in Caldwell Creek, with Reverend Alcott performing the service, the same Reverend Alcott who had witnessed Helen's father's transfer document, and who seemed genuinely pleased to be participating in a happier legal instrument on her behalf. The Pittmans came, and the Edgars, and a dozen other neighbors who had come to feel that Chester Granger was simply part of the landscape of that stretch of Creek Road. Dunmore from the general store was there, and shook Chester's hand afterward with what appeared to be sincere warmth and possibly a degree of personal credit in the matter. Chester wore his best coat, which was the dark wool one he had originally worn to Denver for survey meetings, brushed clean and pressed. Helen wore a blue dress the color of the Colorado sky in May that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered through Dunmore's, and she walked down the aisle of that small white church with her shoulders back and her eyes absolutely direct. And Chester thought, with the clarity that hit him from time to time about the most important things, that she was the most remarkable person he had ever encountered. He said his vows in a clear voice with no hesitation, and she said hers the same way. And when Reverend Alcott pronounced them, married Chester kissed his wife, and the church made the sounds of a small community that was genuinely happy about something. And he thought about a barrel in a general store, and a rope he had put down and never picked up and never minded losing. The first night of their married life they spent at the farm, and the farm felt different in the way that places feel different when their purpose has shifted and settled. In the morning Chester made coffee while Helen slept an extra hour, which she did not usually do, and he stood at the kitchen window looking out at the farm in the spring light, the fence he had repaired still solid, the barn roof holding perfectly, the kitchen garden in early growth, and he felt the particular deep satisfaction of a man who has found the life he was supposed to have. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair down, which she rarely wore it, and her expression was sleepy and unguarded, and she said, "Is that coffee?" "Yes," he said. She came and leaned against the counter beside him and looked out at the farm. "Good morning, husband." "Good morning, wife," he said. They stood there together in the spring light with their coffee for a while, and then there was work to do and they went and did it, side by side, in the way of people who have been doing it for a while and have gotten very good at it together. In June, as promised, Chester took Helen up the mountain. He had spent a month preparing for it, not in an anxious way but in the way of a man who is sharing something that matters to him with someone whose opinion of it matters to him enormously. He made the trail up to the cabin as comfortable as possible without making it soft, because Helen would not have wanted it soft, and she rode the mountain terrain with the same steady confidence she brought to everything else. The first evening, sitting on the front step of the cabin watching the sun go down over the 4 receding mountain ranges, while the air went cold and the stars appeared one by one, Helen was quiet for a long time, and Chester let the quiet be what it was. Then she said, "I understand now." "Yes," he said. "Why you came here, why you stayed." She looked out at the view. "This is like being outside of time. Everything that happened is still happening somewhere down there, but up here it is just this." She gestured at the mountains, the sky, the particular quality of the silence at altitude. "Yes," Chester said, "that is exactly it. I also understand," she said carefully, "why you were willing to leave it." He looked at her profile in the last of the sunset light. "I did not leave it," he said. "I brought something better to it." She looked at him, and the smile that had started as just an edge was wholly open now, the full version of it, the one that had been available since the day he first walked to that counter in Dunmore's store, and seeing it never became ordinary to him, not then and not in the many years after. They spent 3 weeks on the mountain, and the time was one of the best stretches of Chester's life, which was a different and more crowded life now than it had been, and better for it. Helen surveyed beside him on the clearer days, learning the instruments with the same focused application she brought to anything new, and by the second week she was taking readings that were as precise as his own, and he was not even slightly surprised. She added her notes to the botanical maps in her small clear handwriting, and the maps became better for her additions, more complete, the plant distribution overlaid on the terrain in a way that made the whole thing more useful and more beautiful. The cabin, which had been designed for one person living efficiently, was a small, tight fit for two, but they managed with the good humor of people who like each other enough to find proximity amusing rather than grating. Chester built an additional shelf for her books, which she had insisted on bringing several of, and she reorganized his kitchen in a way that made it approximately 40% more functional, and he did not mind at all. When they came back down the mountain in July, Helen was fairly certain she was pregnant, and by August she was very certain, and by September there was no question about it. Chester received this information on a warm Tuesday evening in September of 1879 while he was sharpening a blade at the kitchen table, and he set the blade down and looked at his wife, and Helen watched him with the expression of someone who was prepared for a wide range of possible responses. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands very gently and said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Is it what you want?" She looked at him. "Chester, I am 31. I have been alone on this farm. Yes, it is what I want." He kissed her long and careful. Then he said, "Then I need to build another room." She laughed into his shoulder. He built the room in October, the same month it had all started, working from first light to last, and finishing it in 2 weeks. A proper room off the back of the farmhouse, with a window facing the pasture, and the distant mountain and good solid walls that he insulated against the Colorado winter with extra care. He fitted it with a cradle he had made from birch wood, turned on the lathe at the Pittman farm, and the cradle was beautiful in the simple, direct way of things made by someone who puts his whole attention into his hands. Helen watched him work from the kitchen doorway on the second evening, and then she came out and put her hand on the cradle and ran her thumb along the smooth wood and said, "This is very good work." "It should be," he said. "I had the right reason." She took his hand and held it. Outside the new room's window, the mountain was visible in the distance, the high peaks catching the last of the sun, and the farm was alive around them. The horses in the barn, the garden in its autumn state, the fence on the south side solid and square, the barn roof absolutely sound. Their son was born in February of 1880, on a clear cold morning when the sky was the specific blue of a Colorado winter at altitude, and Chester was present for every moment of it in the way that was not yet entirely common for men of his era, but which seemed to him the only possible thing to do. The doctor from Caldwell Creek had come the night before and stayed, and Abigail Pittman was there because she had experience, and because Helen wanted her, and at 9:30 in the morning a boy arrived in the world with unmistakable opinions about it. Chester held his son for the first time while the February light came through the window, and Helen, exhausted and entirely beautiful, watched him with those calculating brown eyes that were calculating nothing at that moment, just watching. "What is his name?" Abigail Pittman asked from the doorway. Chester looked at Helen. Helen said, "Martin, for my father." Chester nodded. It was exactly right. "Martin Granger," he said quietly, and the name sat perfectly in the morning. Martin Granger was from his earliest moments a person of strong preferences and vigorous expression of same, which Chester found both challenging and enormously entertaining, and which Helen navigated with the calm competence she brought to all challenges, though she confessed to Chester on several late-night occasions that she had not anticipated quite this level of particular opinions in a person of such recent vintage. He had Helen's eyes and Chester's lungs, which was to say he was observant and loud in more or less equal measure. The farm grew in the years that followed. Not dramatically, not through ambition or acquisition at the expense of others, but in the steady, organic way of a working property that was being well managed by two competent people. Chester's railroad survey work brought in reliable income that supplemented the farm's own production, and the surveys were planned now around the seasons of the farm and the family rather than being Chester's entire organizing principle, and he found that this constraint improved both his work and his life. In the spring of 1881, Chester made what he considered the best practical decision of his professional life, which was to hire a young Ute man named Thomas Gray Cloud, who had grown up in the region, and whose knowledge of the mountain terrain was superior to any written survey Chester had access to, and who turned out to also be one of the most skilled trackers and naturalists Chester had encountered. Chester paid him a fair wage and treated him with the respect his knowledge deserved, which was not as universal a practice in 1881 as it should have been, and Thomas Gray Cloud worked with Chester for the better part of the next decade, and became someone Chester considered a genuine colleague and friend. Helen's legal knowledge, built from years of necessity, began to be consulted by neighbors with less experience in such matters, first informally, and then with a regularity that made it clear there was real need. She helped the Pittmans navigate a boundary dispute in 1881, and helped a widow named Clara Stokes in 1882 fight off a property claim that had the same character as Holt's original fraud. And she won. And by 1883, there were people riding 2 counties over to ask Helen Granger for her opinion on documents they had been handed by people they were not sure they trusted. Chester watched his wife read a fraudulent contract across the kitchen table with her coffee cup at her elbow, and her pen making small, precise notations in the margin, and he thought, not for the first time, that the world had not fully understood what it had in her, and that it was slowly beginning to find out. Silas Holt did not return to the Grady land. He had other problems by 1880, a cattle disease that decimated his herd, and a water lawsuit that went against him in Denver, and a departure from Caldwell Creek in 1882 that was not discussed much by those who knew the details but was clearly not voluntary. Carter Thompson, his attorney, moved his practice to Kansas City. Chester did not spend much time thinking about either of them. In the autumn of 1882, Helen told Chester she was expecting again. He was on the porch when she told him, both of them watching Martin, now 2.5 and fully mobile in a way that required constant supervision, attempting to convince the farm cat to cooperate with some scheme he had developed. Chester watched his son for a moment and then looked at his wife. "How are you?" he asked. "Excellent," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise very well." "Martin will be 3 by the time this one arrives," Chester said. "Almost exactly," she said. "He will be impossible," Chester said with deep affection. "He is currently impossible," Helen said. "He will adjust." Their second child was a daughter, born in June of 1883, with Chester's gray-green eyes and Helen's particular expression of interested assessment, and they named her Clara after the widow Helen had helped the previous year, who had become a friend of the family, and also because it was a name that both of them liked, and the coincidence of the two reasons seemed like a good omen. Clara had her father's patience and her mother's precision, and was from a very early age an observer rather than an instigator, watching the world with those gray-green eyes with the specific quality of someone who was storing everything for later reference. Martin adored her from the first moment, and was thereafter in her immediate vicinity at every possible opportunity, which was both touching and occasionally logistically inconvenient. The summer of 1884 was the summer Chester took both of them up the mountain for the first time, Martin at 4 and Clara at 1 and a year old. With Helen managing, the baby carrier Chester had specifically engineered for the mountain terrain, and the experience was an education in what it meant to observe the high country through the eyes of a 4-year-old who had his mother's vocabulary and his father's complete disregard for altitude. Martin stood on the front step of the mountain cabin and looked out at the 4 receding mountain ranges in the evening light and said, "It is very big." "Yes," Chester said. "Are all the mountains ours?" "No," Chester said. "They belong to themselves." Martin considered this with the seriousness of a person being told something important. Then he said, "But we can visit them." "We can always visit them," Chester said. He looked at Helen over their son's head. She was holding Clara, who was regarding the mountains with what Chester was fairly sure was the expression of someone annotating new data, and she looked back at him, and the smile was fully open in the evening light, the version of it he had been watching come fully open for 5 years, and it had never become ordinary. He thought about the rope. He thought about it sometimes, with the particular quality of a man who has examined an accident that led somewhere extraordinary, and cannot quite decide if accident is the right word. He had come to town for a rope and put it down and walked away from it, and 6 years later he was standing on a mountain in the evening light with his wife and his children and a life that was full in every direction. And the rope had never come up in any serious way again except as the story of how everything started. He had eventually bought a different rope, 2 months after the wedding, from a supplier in Denver, and it was a good rope, but it was not the story. The story was the moment of putting the rope down, the moment of walking to the counter because a woman's voice had the sound of a person who was not going to break but who needed someone beside her anyway, and the particular quality of making a choice that is not exactly a decision in the formal sense, but is nevertheless completely, irrevocably his. He would not go back and change it for anything. In the years after 1884, life on the Grady farm, which everyone in Caldwell Creek called the Granger farm now without anyone having explicitly decided to, continued to be a life that accumulated the good things slowly and steadily in the way of properly maintained things. The farm prospered modestly. Chester's surveys became a standard reference for the railroad companies working the Colorado high country, and he was occasionally asked to consult on engineering questions that his field experience qualified him to address in ways that purely academic surveyors could not. Thomas Gray Cloud eventually started his own surveying operation, using the skills and training and connections he had built during his years working with Chester, and Chester helped him establish it with the same practical energy he brought to anything he cared about. Helen's informal legal consulting eventually led, in 1886, to a formal arrangement with a Denver attorney named Watson, who was handling a number of property rights cases in the mountain counties, and who was intelligent enough to recognize that Helen Granger's understanding of local land tenure, document examination, and the specific patterns of rural fraud was worth compensating properly. It was an arrangement that respected the constraints of her life, the farm, the children, the responsibilities that came with both, and it gave her work that was commensurate with her actual capacity in a way that very few women of her era were given. Chester was unreservedly proud of this and said so, frequently enough that Martin eventually asked his mother why his father kept telling everyone at Dunmore's about her cases, and Helen said it was because Chester Granger was the most direct person she had ever met, and he had no internal mechanism for keeping good things quiet. And Martin said, "Like me." And Helen said, "Yes, exactly like you." And this was clearly being said with great love. In the autumn of 1886, Chester and Helen sat together on the back porch of the farm on a cool October evening that was the color and temperature of the October evening 8 years earlier when it had all begun. And they sat close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, and the farm was quiet around them. Martin was 7 and currently involved in an elaborate project of unknown purpose in the barn that he had been very secretive about for 3 days. Clara, 3 years old, was allegedly asleep, but was demonstrably reading to herself in her room in the low, persistent voice of a child who has discovered that books do not have a bedtime, which was a development that Chester found impossible to be stern about. "Are you happy?" Helen asked. Chester looked at her. The question was direct and genuine, and asked without any of the anxiety that the question sometimes carries. Just genuine curiosity from a person who wanted to know, the same person who had always wanted to know the actual answer to things. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said. "I am also aware that it is a strange thing for a man who was convinced he was suited to solitude to find himself saying." "Were you wrong?" Helen asked. "About being suited to solitude?" He thought about it seriously. "No, I was right then. I suited the solitude and it suited me, and if I had not come down from that mountain I would have been content, not happy in this way, but content." He paused. "But I did come down, and I found something that was better than content." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I told you in October of 1878 that I was not in a position to be the thing that changed a man's life." "You did," he said. "I was wrong," she said. "You were," he agreed. "In the best possible way." She laughed softly. From the barn came the sound of Martin doing something with what appeared to be a significant amount of wood, and from inside the house came the sound of Clara's voice reading about something with great conviction. And from very far away, at the edge of the visible world, the mountain was a dark shape against the evening sky, familiar and permanent and entirely compatible with being exactly here. Chester Granger, who had come to town for a rope and left without it, held his wife's hand on the back porch of a farm that had been held and won and built into something real and good, and he thought about the precise moment of a rope set down on a barrel and a choice made without deliberation in the direction of something that had turned out to be his whole life. He did not mind. He had never minded, not for a single day. The stars came out one by one in the Colorado sky, and the farm was warm and alive around them. And Helen Grady Granger sat against her husband's side with the same steady, direct, entirely certain quality that she had brought to the counter of Dunmore's General Store on a Tuesday morning in October of 1878. When a large man from the mountains had put down a rope he had come a long way for and walked over to stand beside her, and everything had changed. It was, by any measure, the best rope Chester Granger ever did not buy. And in the years that followed, when Martin was old enough to ask about the origin of things, Chester told him the story of the rope in the barrel and the woman at the counter and the 4 days that became the rest of his life. And Martin asked if he had ever gone back for a different rope. And Chester said yes, eventually, a good rope from Denver. And Martin said but it was not the same. And Chester said no, it was not. Nothing after that was quite the same as before it. And Martin sat with that information with the seriousness of a child who was storing something important. And later that evening Chester heard him telling Clara about the rope in the particular solemn tones of a 7-year-old conveying a legend. Clara asked if the rope was magic. Martin said no, the rope was just a rope, that was the whole point. He had listened to the story with his father's precision and his mother's understanding, and he had gotten it exactly right. Helen, hearing this from the kitchen doorway, caught Chester's eye across the room, and the look they exchanged had everything in it that 7 years of that life had built. The barn roof and the creek road and the county hearing and the mountain in the evening light, and the cradle made of birch wood, and every morning at that kitchen table, and every night by that fire. And it was a look that needed no translation, the look of two people who have found the right person and know it and have not stopped knowing it. Chester smiled. Helen smiled back. The Colorado evening settled around the farm, and the mountain held its place on the horizon. And in the Granger household on the creek road east of Caldwell Creek, everything was exactly as it should be, completely and permanently and without question, just as it would remain.